How do you know what pin thread you need for your grinder? There is a list on the website under frequently asked questions that lists all the grinders and known pin threads that we're aware of to date. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a way to go onto the internet or even the manufacturer's websites to find out what size this handle is. So we've had to accumulate a list on our own, and we're putting them up there as we get them and as people give them to us. What you can do, the best way to find out what size you need, is to take the handle off your grinder, take this into a hardware store, into the nut and bolt section, and try nuts on it until you figure out the right one. The most popular are M8 by 1.25. Second most popular is M10 by 1.5. And then we have 5/16 18 and 3/8 16. Start with those, and that will be the best way to find out what size thread you need for your grinder. I want to address a question that I get a lot about people saying that it's grinding too much off of their blades. It's not grinding at a 30-degree angle on their blades. What's actually happening is the jig is always grinding at 30 degrees as compared to the mounting surface of the blade itself. What's happening is some blades are not flat on the ends. So here's some examples of some blades, and if you can take a look at these blades, these are a couple of commercial blades that as they lay flat on the table, the end of the blade is also flat on the table. So all three of these angles are actually at 30 degrees, actually this way. All three of these angles are actually at 30 degrees. But as you can see, this blade, it's ground a much larger surface because the blade itself is angled. So it is grinding at 30 degrees as compared to where it's mounted, but it takes much more off of the blade. One way to deal with this, if you do have a blade like this, is to put some shims on the top part of the vise head. What this is going to do is tip this blade up a little bit like this when you grind it, and it's going to grind a heavier angle on the blade, but in reality you're probably grinding at 35 degrees or maybe 40 degrees as compared to the mounting surface. So the way I'm going to demonstrate this today is to tape some shims up here on the vise. I'm just going to use Scotch tape so that you can see what I'm doing. I wouldn't do this normally when I'm grinding, but you'll be able to see what I'm doing here. So I'm moving the shims up as close as I can to the screws up front. And if I just do one set of shims, I'll put this blade in, and you can see that we are still in contact with the screws enough that this blade clamps in just fine. This blade has such an angle on it that I would probably put two sets of shims on here, which I will do right now. And I'm just going to put them right over top of the first ones, again getting them up as close to the screws as I can. But now, because I've done that, what you'll see is that the screws no longer catch the blade. We can fix this by adjusting these screws up. These screws are set at the factory to be the same height, and they are blue Loctited in, so you can turn them out. I'm going to go a turn and a half. You can do whatever you need to do, just as long as you do both screws exactly the same and you remember how much you turned it out. So now when we put this in, the blade catches the screws, we can tighten things down, and now on the surface of the blade we're going to be grinding a heavier angle on the blade, and it's probably more like 35 or 40 degrees. So that's the way you deal with a blade with an angled end. Now that we've done this, I want to talk about these screws a little bit more. We've pulled these screws, we've moved them out, and now when we try and put a blade in there, they're too tall. There's space underneath there. So we're going to want to put them back to where they started. So I remember I went a turn and a half. I'm going to go back in a turn and a half on each screw. And they're back to where they started. Now if you forget where you're at, or you just don't remember how many turns you did, that's fine. These are set at the factory to be about 300 thousandths off of the top of the jig. You can use a pair of calipers if you want and recheck them. If you don't have calipers, that's fine. Just a simple screw. You can go back to these, which you didn't adjust. You can just come down, say, okay, this is our distance. You can recheck them. You can adjust them in and out. So as long as they're all the same, as long as these two screws are the same, you're good to go. Some mower blades are much smaller than the standard commercial mower blade. Here's an example of two different blades. This is a regular commercial mower blade. Fits in the vise just fine, tightens up. But what happens when we try and put this blade in is that the vise will not tighten up all the way and we can't hold this blade. The way we deal with this is to take the screw all the way out, flip this block around, put the screw back in, and now the vise head will hold the smaller blade. A lot of customers ask me what blade they should be using or what grinding disc they should be using. Here's an example of two different types of blades, types of grinding wheels. I recommend a 36 or 40 grit flapper wheel on the website because it's the most forgiving, especially for somebody that's just starting to grind. But you can use a hard wheel, and there's a lot of customers that prefer hard wheels. I actually do a lot of my grinding with a hard wheel, but there's some things you need to know. They will give you different grinds, and there are dangers to using a hard wheel as opposed to a flapper wheel. Let's talk about the grinds first. The flapper wheel is going to give you a softer grind. It's more of a convex grind, as you can see by this blade. The hard wheel is going to give you more of a hollow ground or a concave grind. Both are perfectly acceptable, but what you need to be aware of is if you're using a hard wheel, particularly a brand new one that has a very hard edge at the front, if you're grinding up away like I show in my other videos, you have to be very careful because you can make a divot or dig into the blade very quickly and very easily. So there's nothing wrong with using this blade or this blade. This one is much less forgiving. After it's been worn down a little bit, it's a little bit easier to use, but you can use either blade. And these are the two different grinds that you're going to get from both blades. Both are perfectly acceptable. I want to talk about adjusting the pivot bushing to the extremes. There's been a few customers that have told me they need to move the bushing all the way to the, or further to the left or further to the right. So the way it comes to you in the box is just like this. This should take care of most normal situations. But for a blade like this that's been ground way back, I want to move the bushing as far as I can to the left. So what I'm going to do is take the bushing out, put the lock nut back on, and then I'm going to put the bushing in from this direction. And I'm about flush there, and then I'm going to lock it in position. Now that's as far to the left as you can get the bushing. Now as you can see on this blade, it's been ground way back. I'm still not completely in the center, but if you're going to be off in any direction, you're better to be off to the right hand side. So as you can see, this blade was actually ground with exactly this position, and it turned out just fine. Now the opposite of that would be turning or having the bushing all the way to the right extreme, and it's the same thing, except we're just going to put it in from this direction with the lock nut on the right hand side. And we're just barely sticking out here. And now your grinder is all the way to the right. I've had a few customers tell me that with a cordless grinder, their battery pack is interfering with the guide arms. A way to deal with this, if you've got a large battery pack, it could hit down here. The way to deal with this is to just simply flip the arms around. There's nothing wrong with flipping the arms around. It works exactly the same in this position. The only thing you need to be aware of is that if you adjust the bushing to the right too far, you actually could get the blade in contact with that arm. But as long as you stay away from there, you're absolutely fine grinding in this position.